Hi BookTube, and welcome to another non-fiction review. The book we're looking at today is a combination of two things. Firstly, it's a steady march through the 19th century and just beyond, up to the First World War, and it illustrates how society has changed by following the fortunes of one wealthy family. But secondly, it's a movingly told personal story, which has been reconstructed by a decade's worth of research into records, personal correspondence, and it would be an invaluable resource for anyone who's wanting to get a close-up perspective of Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy and see their response to the political and economic changes that occurred throughout that long century. The book we're looking at today is Champagne and Shambles, The Arkwrights and the Country House in Crisis by Catherine Beale. The foreword written by Ronald Blythe. Now, some booktubers may be familiar with Ronald Blythe. He was the author of the 1969 novel Akenfield, which was like a time capsule novel, just capturing a portrait of English rural life, and it's available currently as a Penguin Classics edition. But back to Champagne and Shambles, it was published in the year 2006. It's 302 pages long, but a lot of that is resource, which we will come to. The actual text is 226 pages. Prices on Amazon are handsomer than you would expect given the age of the book, and I think that's because it's brought out by a small press, the History Press, and so prices, it's going to have smaller print runs, and prices will be accordingly a little more expensive regardless of how old the book is. The cheapest one I did find online, however, was a copy going for £3.30. That didn't include delivery, but delivery was quite reasonable. My copy was loaned to me by an MK Dons fan. We were having a chat conversation about economics. I was trying to explain Keith Thomas's chapters about witchcraft in his book Religion and the Decline of Magic, and how the witchcraft persecution in England, not necessarily in continental Europe, but in England, may have had more to do with economics than with theology, with the standard of living and how people were coping financially rather than their religious beliefs. And this led on to a talk about, what do we really know about the changes economically that happened from century to century in England. And then he said, I think I have a book you might be interested in. And so he brought Champagne and Shambles over to me. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, yes, this is exactly what I want to know about. Let's talk about our author, Catherine Beale, who is not to be confused, just in case you do go online looking for her. There is a British watercolor artist with the same name. She also has a YouTube channel, Catherine Beale 7158. That is not the same Catherine Beale, although her paintings are lovely. So I would still say, please go and look at both, if you will. It was fantastic to visit her channel, even so. But Catherine Beale, our author, was born in Herefordshire, and of course the family that she chooses to follow were based in Herefordshire. She went to Cheltenham Ladies' College, and from there on to Cambridge University. It's interesting that she makes a short mention of Cheltenham Ladies' College in Champagne and Shambles, and I am going to just divert from my normal course of things when I cover author information and just read this little passage. It's on page 197 of the book, and it's describing a prospective fiancée named Stephanie Robinson. And it goes like this. So it says, Stephanie herself was a thoroughly modern daughter of the landed gentry and a strong rider to hounds in her youth. Her education at home had been rounded off by 2 years at Cheltenham Ladies' College, the school then gaining ground under the inspired leadership of Dorothea Beale. This education made Stephanie rather a blue-stocking. Schools like Cheltenham had been mocked by Gilbert and Sullivan, and then it quotes some song lyrics. A woman's college, maddest folly going. What can girls learn within its walls worth knowing? So that's That's just an aside. I thought it was interesting that she'd looked that up, given that she'd gone to Cheltenham herself. Anyway, back to Catherine Beale. Catherine began her career after university by getting involved at Hampton Court and doing tour guiding. She also wrote the 2000 guidebook to the property, and this is the property which belonged to the Arkwright family that she chooses to focus her research on for Champagne and Shambles. And currently she still gives talks about aspects of local history, and you can see that is her website address. It's not the same one as the watercolor artist. On that one you'll have her details if you are living in the UK and you're interested in booking her for a talk on this subject. Structure, there's a lot to talk about in terms of structure with this book. Let's get to it. Introduction, 12 pages, followed by 15 chapters, which average about 13 pages each. Now, the font in this book, I would say, is 11 point. It is a serif style, possibly Times New Roman, and it's single-spaced. And if there are quotations in the book, which there are frequently, those are in even smaller font. The top and bottom margins in the paperback, they're about an inch, but the left and right margins were quite narrow. And that, along with the stiff binding, in fact, I'm going to put my face back on camera again just to show you the book itself. So you can see it's a very glossy cover and very stiff on the spine, but also the pages are quite thick. The paper quality, if I knew what the number was, I would quote it. But you can see that you can't see the inside margins when I open it ever so slightly. In order to read the full text of the book, you would either have to open the book up so wide that you would risk damaging the spine, or if you did like I did, because it was a borrowed book, you would not open it very much. You'd keep it sort of like this, but then you'd be peering, doing strange angles and things in order to see the inside margins of the book. So if you were going to study this book and use it as a reference, you might well be advised to get an electronic copy, just because that would be easier to move through and to read, and you could change the font if that was better for you for reading. It's packed, though, this book, absolutely packed with resources. So the one reason you might want a paperback copy is that you tend to get better visuals. For example, there are 30 black and white photographic plates, which are family pictures, obviously taken from the records. It would be better to have those in paperback. Similarly, too, there are a couple of maps and a family tree of the Arkwrights going back 5 generations. That would be easier to look at in a paperback version than on ebooks, or at least my experience with ebooks is that illustrations don't go well unless you can put them onto a really nice tablet. If you're just using your phone or a black and white Kindle, not so effective. There's also 2 pages of acknowledgements, 5 pages of bibliography, 52 pages of notes, so very thorough notes, and a 15-page subject index. A word about the writing style. The style in Champagne and Shambles has to accomplish 2 things. One, it's got to convey historical detail in quantity in order to do justice to all the research that Catherine Beale put in, but also meet the expectations of the kind of readers who would buy a book from a publishing company that calls itself the History Press. Secondly, though, it does need to provide for it to be a readable book, an enjoyable read, and for people to pick it up, because when you're a small press like the History Press, you've got to do what you can to build an audience. So I think also the writing style reflects a certain amount of educated speculation, and that it presents in addition to the facts. So you're just trying to give the prose a bit of life. You're leaning toward historical fiction, but without becoming fiction. Of course, if you only read historical fiction and you're thinking of this as a kind of transition into nonfiction, then I would only say, okay, the style of the book may seem a bit ponderous at first. There will be no dialogue, for example. It doesn't go so far as that. If, though, your passion, fiction-wise, is those English Victorian novels where the sentences are already a little bit on the ponderous side, then I think you'll be fine. But also you'll be well rewarded with insights about the time period, and that's going to inform your other reading. If you read only nonfiction, you might question, rightly so, those places, and they're not many, where the author implies certain emotions being felt by the characters without actually quoting from personal correspondence as evidence. She may have personal correspondence to back it up, but where she does not cite it, you're left wondering, okay, are you presuming what the character's feeling? I didn't feel that was done too often, or that it headed into the realms of, really? Do you think so? I think it's fair to say that the weight of the research in this book plays a much greater role than conjecture or narrative license. This isn't really a book that can be summarized because it covers such a long period of time and so many individuals. So what I'm going to do is just kind of hop around the chapters to give you a flavor of some of the things that you can gain from reading Champagne and Shambles. We'll start in chapter 3, which was titled Master of the Estate, because it was in that chapter that I learned something about the heirs to these great landed estates and country homes. I just assumed that when father died and eldest son took over, he just got everything. He owned everything, but that was not necessarily the case. Sometimes to protect the estate and keep it within the family, and also to ensure that various members of the family were treated well, a lot of times those wills that were drawn up by the deceased contained a lot of requirements to pay off certain people. Certain assets were held in trust, and therefore it meant that not just the heir to the estate, but maybe 2 or 3 other people needed to be consulted before anything could be done with that particular asset. And I found that fascinating. The next chapter that we looked at, chapter 4, Mastering the Family, was a lovely one purely for the little insights it gave you into leisure time, what people did in their leisure time. For example, the Arkwrights had a favorite parlor game, and I imagine they must have learned this from somewhere else. I don't know where they picked it up from, but they would ask, if they had guests over, they would ask each guest to write a poem, and they were given a title as a prompt. That title was usually a question and 1 or 2 vocabulary words also that they had to work into this poem. So very challenging games. The book doesn't say how long each person got to compose their poem. I'm going to read you an example of something one of the guests produced as a result of this game. And maybe you can guess how long it must have taken them to compose it. This was written in answer to the prompt, "Do you ever fish for compliments?" And here's the poem. "I go out early in the morning and I fish the livelong day, but I never get a compliment, so my fishing does not pay. The river may be full of them, but they never take my bait. I see them swimming all around while drearily I wait. Perhaps they see my line too plain, in terror take their flight, and never come that way again if I fish till 10 at night. So now, my friends, be warned by me, for compliments don't fish, but wait until you see them lie before you in a dish." Later on in the chapter, there was also a curious wedding custom. Some people who live in the UK, maybe you're aware of this, but I wasn't. It was called the throwing of the slipper. After the wedding ceremony was over, the wedding guests, it was traditional for them to throw slippers at the bride and the groom. And the person who watches television said he'd heard of a similar custom, not quite the same, but one where the bride's father would present the groom with a shoe, and it was a way of symbolizing the handing over of his authority over his daughter to the groom as her new husband. Oh, and one other thing just for fans of Anthony Trollope's writing. If you remember the characterization that Trollope did of the hunting parson, that was based on one of the Arkwright brothers, Joseph, who was vicar and master of the Essex Foxhounds, and that was exactly the same time that Trollope was living at Waltham House, and that was in the same county, and he was enjoying his most prolific period of writing. So he was basing his idea of the hunting parson on Joseph Arkwright. I found the sections in the book that were talking about the family dynamic within the Arkwrights really interesting. They had a very good family dynamic, and that must have been rare in the 19th century. It clearly seems that the second generation, Johnny Arkwright and his wife was born Lucy Davenport, that they did honestly seem to be a love match. Not only did they write each other copious letters throughout their marriage, but they were particularly communicative when they were courting. In fact, when they were courting, they actually wrote notes to each other, sometimes when they were just in adjoining rooms in the house, and sometimes, or once at least, they wrote each other a note while they sat side by side on the same couch, which I found quite funny. I almost thought, wow, imagine if they had smartphones. That's all they'd be doing, the two of them, just sending text messages back and forth. What I also noticed, which again, I think must have been rare in the 19th century, was the honest affection that Johnny and Lucy had for their children. That is, they wanted to spend time with them personally. Yes, they had governesses to take away some of the burden of child rearing, but it's clear from their correspondence that they loved spending time with children themselves, doing childish, playful things with them. For those wanting this book for a bit of social history, I would say the second half of the book becomes very important because it begins to outline exactly what changed in the second half of the 19th century that began to affect the large landowners. Firstly, of course, we know the Industrial Revolution gradually demanded more and more workers, needed more workers in the cities. Those jobs paid better than most agricultural labor. So you can imagine what happens. You get a drain of labor from the country into the city. That meant that the remaining agricultural workers began to ask, why are we not organizing, as we see our compatriots in the city in factories doing? Why don't we organize and ask for better conditions, ask for better pay? We can now. We have some leverage. And so that created an interesting additional financial burden on most estates as they began to raise wages, while at the same time, Chapter 10 begins to talk about how in the 1870s and early 1880s, you had several changes in agriculture itself. You had some very poor harvests throughout the 1870s. And this combined with, well, it's a colonial irony, really, because Britain had gone out and conquered territory in South Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and all these places became agricultural powerhouses themselves. And the foodstuffs that were coming in from those colonies helped supply Britain during those poor harvests. But then you see what happened was they continued to be made available, and they lowered the prices of grain and cattle, made it more difficult for those landowners who were now paying their workers higher wages to make ends meet when they were getting less money for the food that their land produced. There's also a section in Chapter 10 which talks about the 1876 Land Ownership Survey. It was also called the Second Domesday Book because it was only the second time since 1086 that there had been any record of the details of large land ownership. So it also cast a spotlight as to how land was being used and how few people actually owned the land that was being farmed in England. So the situation continued to intensify, those same financial pressures. The situation for the Arkwright family became so acute in the 1880s that Johnny Arkwright had to respond to the passing of the new Ramsden Estate Act and reschedule his debts so that the estate would not become bankrupt. But that was really just a short stay of execution, if you like. By the end of the 19th century, when Johnny had died and his son Jack had taken over the estate, the financial pressures became so acute that Jack finally had to consult with other family members and take a decision to start selling off large parts of their estate, including Hampton Court itself. Rabbit hole. Well, as I was reading Champagne and Shambles, I was reminded of George Eliot's Middlemarch, and in particular of one character, of old Mr. Featherstone. For anyone who's not familiar with Middlemarch, it is set in the Midlands, the West Midlands of England, during the 1830s. And Mr. Featherstone is a wealthy landowner, and he's got no son of his own, no heir at all. And there's a lot of speculation, therefore, in his extended family as to who will get his land, which is the source of his wealth. And Mr. Featherstone demonstrates an attitude toward land ownership that I think must have echoed the views of the Arkwrights and many other wealthy families during the 19th century. Land and the making of wealth from land, they were important. They were considered unquestionable, almost a sacred trust that had to be held on to at all costs. And therefore, the aristocracy and landowners in England had less confidence in the newer ways of making wealth, like buying and trading in stocks and shares or directly investing in a business, lending capital. And I've not read enough of George Eliot's other writings to know what was her opinion about these two different kinds of money making. One based in land, things that can be seen and touched and moved, versus the economy that was beginning to be based on investments or things that were at a distance, overseas trade, for example. But she was certainly observing that both existed, and she has, old Mr. Featherstone, express his opinions about wealth and the best way to obtain and hold on to wealth. And I'm going to quote now. This is from the Penguin Classics Paperback edition, reprinted in 2003. I'll have full details in my description box. We're in chapter 12. We're on page 110. Mr. Featherstone is speaking to his nephew, Fred, and he's comparing himself against one of Fred's other uncles, a Mr. Bulstrode, who is a banker. And this is the quote. I know what you mean. You'd sooner offend me than Bulstrode. And what's he? He's got no land hereabout that ever I heard tell of. A speculating fellow. He may come down any day when the devil leaves off backing him, and that's what his religion means. He wants God Almighty to come in. That's nonsense. There's one thing I made out pretty clear when I used to go to church, and it's this. God Almighty sticks to the land. He promises land, and he gives land, and he makes chaps rich with corn and cattle. But you take the other side. You like Bulstrode and speculation better than Featherstone and land. So if Mr. Featherstone is any indication of what the wealthy landowners thought generally, then you can see his level of confidence during the 1830s. Land still seemed to be an unerring source of wealth, and land ownership almost divinely ordained. John Arkwright's father would have been of Mr. Featherstone's generation and invested in land, doubtless believing that the land would always be the best way for gaining and maintaining wealth. And it's ironic because the wealth that the Arkwrights built, which allowed them to join the landed classes, came from industry, new inventions that were changing industry. And this is what makes the Arkwright story particularly fascinating, because it shows the contradictions and the shifting ground of the 19th century economically. A man could make his money now in whole new ways, and he could invest it as if the old ways would continue to be the better ones, and then, surprise, surprise, see his wealth erode because the new ways and the new worlds finally began to undermine the old. And no one could really foresee that, because for centuries it had always been land. Always. So that's my review done. In fact, that's all the books that I read in March now reviewed. So lovely way to sort of close things up. And I do need to close things up. In fact, I need to make an announcement for those who watched the weekend's Middlemarch meditation. You will already know this, but I want to just let everybody know that I'm going to be taking a break from today, and you won't see another video coming from me until the first Wednesday in May. Now, that's not some kind of burnout break or anything dramatic like that. This is just something family related that's been planned for some time. And yeah, there's possibility that I might be able to film and edit. I'll certainly be reading. That's no problem. But filming and editing, because of all the stuff that's going on, what I do with my time will be out of my hands a great deal for all the right reasons. And so I thought probably better, rather than leave you wondering what's going on and me wondering when I can make something go on, better to just say, look, let's have a break, and I'll see everybody again at the beginning of May. So in the meantime, everybody, have good reading, whatever that means for you, and I shall see you again in a few weeks' time. Take care. Bye-bye.